You reach for a snack before you've even finished digesting breakfast. It takes you seconds, barely any chewing. Just swallow and go. For most of human history, eating was not that easy. For roughly 2 million years, before your body looked anything like it does now, food was a fight. You had to tear it, grind it, and chew it, sometimes for hours a day, just to pull enough energy out of it to survive. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, still live this way. Researchers who follow wild chimpanzee troops have recorded them chewing raw fruit and leaves for something like 6 hours out of every day. 6 hours, most of their waking life, spent just breaking food down small enough to swallow. You spend maybe 30 minutes eating on an average day. So what actually changed? Harvard biological anthropologist Richard Wrangham has spent decades arguing that the answer is fire, not fire for warmth, and not fire for keeping predators away, though it helped with both. Fire for cooking. In his book Catching Fire, published in 2009, Wrangham laid out what researchers now call the cooking hypothesis. Humans became human, biologically, because cooked food changed how much energy our bodies could pull from what we ate. Here is the mechanism, and it is simpler than it sounds. Heat breaks down starch, and heat unwinds protein. A cooked egg is digested far more completely than a raw one, and cooked meat costs your gut less energy to process than raw meat does. Wrangham's claim is not just that cooked food tastes better. It is that a raw diet alone cannot support a body and a brain built like yours. This is the detail that gets me every time. It is not just theory. In 2011, a Harvard researcher named Rachel Carmody ran an experiment feeding mice identical meat and identical yams. One group raw, one group cooked. Same ingredients, same calorie count on paper. The mice eating cooked food gained noticeably more weight than the mice eating raw food because their bodies did not have to spend as much energy extracting what was already there. Digestion has a cost, and cooking pays part of that cost for you before food ever reaches your mouth. So when did this start? This is where the evidence gets thinner and where researchers genuinely disagree. Wrangham argues fire-based cooking goes back roughly 1.8 million years to the appearance of Homo erectus, whose smaller teeth, shrinking gut, and changed body proportions all look like an animal adapted to easier, more energy-dense food. But the archaeological record for fire that old is almost non-existent. The clearest, most widely accepted evidence for controlled fire comes much later. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found burned bone and ash dated to around 1 million years ago, deep enough inside the cave that it likely was not a wildfire. At a site called Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, researchers found repeated evidence of burning at hearths dated to roughly 790,000 years ago. Both sites are real, both are debated, and neither reaches back as far as Wrangham's original claim. Most archaeologists agree that fire became a daily, dependable part of human life, somewhere between 400,000 and 300,000 years ago. Whether it started quietly, earlier than that, without leaving much trace, is still an open question. What is not in question is what a smaller gut and a bigger brain cost you. Brain tissue is expensive, and pound for pound, it burns through roughly 20 times more energy than muscle does. In 1995, researchers Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler proposed what is now called the expensive tissue hypothesis. As the human brain grew larger over evolutionary time, the human gut grew smaller. You cannot afford 2 expensive organs at once on a low-quality diet, so something had to give the brain room to grow. Cooked food, easier to digest and richer in available calories, may be exactly what allowed that trade to happen. Homo habilis, an early relative, carried a brain of around 600 cubic centimeters. Homo erectus, the species Wrangham points to, carried closer to 900. You are walking around with something near 1,350. That growth did not come free. So picture it. A small group of early humans at a hearth, maybe 700,000 years ago, at dusk. The fire is not just light, it is insurance. A hunter who came back empty-handed still gets to eat something that day, because tubers and scavenged meat sitting near the coals are worth more, calorically, once they are cooked. The group processes food faster, spends less of the day chewing, and gets hours back that a chimpanzee never has. What do you do with hours you did not have before? Wrangham pushes further here, and this is one of his more debated claims. He suggests fire created a new kind of dependency, one where a person, cooking alone at camp, needed protection, and that this may have shaped early pair bonding and divides in labor between men and women. It is a compelling idea, and it is also one that other anthropologists push back on hard, arguing it leans too heavily on assumptions about gender roles that the fossil record simply cannot confirm. Worth knowing both sides of that argument exist. Freed up time is not just an ancient story either. In 1963, anthropologist Richard Lee spent months living with and studying the Dobjuhoansi, a foraging community in the Kalahari, and clocked their subsistence work at something like 15 hours a week. That number reshaped how anthropologists thought about foraging life, away from constant desperate struggle, and towards something more like a workable rhythm. It is worth being careful here. The Juhoansi today are a contemporary people living modern lives, not a frozen window into the deep past, and their labor patterns reflect their own specific environment, not every forager who ever lived everywhere. But the finding still complicates a popular myth, the idea that ancient life was nothing but scraping for survival from dawn to dusk. Cooking, by cutting down digestion and chewing time, may be part of why some of that time was ever available to begin with. Here is the twist that most people miss. You cannot actually live on raw food alone, not you, not any modern human. In a 2005 study, researcher Corinna Koebnick and colleagues followed a group of people on a strict long-term raw food diet and found a striking pattern. A majority of the women in the study had stopped menstruating entirely. Their bodies simply did not have enough available energy to sustain reproduction, let alone anything else. Modern raw foodist communities eat different foods and move differently than Ice Age foragers did, so the comparison is not perfect. But the underlying biology lines up with what Wrangham argued. Somewhere in your evolutionary past, your ancestors' bodies made a bet on cooked food, and every cell in you is still living under the terms of that bet. There is a popular version of this story that gets told badly, and it is worth clearing up. You have probably heard some version of the caveman stereotype, hunched, grunting, barely scraping by, a brutish creature, only a few steps removed from an ape. The fossil and archaeological evidence does not support that picture. A species cooking its food, tending fires, and reorganizing its daily schedule around a hearth is not a brute. It is closer to an engineer, quietly running a low-grade energy experiment for 1,000,000 years and letting biology keep the results that worked. The smaller teeth are not a sign of weakness. They are a sign that something upstream of the mouth was already doing part of the job. If anything, the sequence runs the other direction from the stereotype, since managing fire safely, keeping it fed through the night, and coordinating a group around it all take real planning and real cooperation, the kind of behavior that does not fit comfortably inside the word brutish at all. There is also a real scientific argument happening underneath all of this, and honest science means naming it. Some researchers think meat eating, not cooking, deserves most of the credit for early brain growth, pointing to stone tools used for butchery that predate the clearest fire evidence by well over 1,000,000 years. Others argue the two are not competing explanations at all, since raw meat is itself hard to fully digest, and cooking would have made whatever meat early humans caught go that much further. Wrangham and a collaborator, Rachel Carmody again, published work in 2010 arguing that human rib cages and pelvises are shaped differently than a chimpanzee's. Specifically because our guts got smaller once cooked food became reliable, evidence read directly from the skeleton, not just inferred from behavior. Critics counter that skeletal evidence this indirect can be interpreted more than one way. Neither side has fully won the argument, and a responsible account of this topic says so plainly, instead of picking a side and presenting it as closed. Let's go back to that hearth one more time, because there is a detail worth sitting with. Fire does something a raw diet never could. It turns dinner into a fixed point in the day. A troop of chimpanzees eats when and where food happens to be, scattered through daylight hours, mostly alone or in shifting small groups. A group of early humans gathered around a fire at night is doing something different, sharing a single location, a single light source, and very likely, a single meal, cooked together and eaten together. Some anthropologists think this nightly gathering is where extended conversation, storytelling, and even early forms of teaching had room to take root, simply because for the first time, there was a long stretch of dark, food-secured hours with nothing else demanding the group's attention, hours a daytime forager, chewing tough raw plants under a hot sun, simply never had. That claim is harder to test than digestion rates in a lab, and it stays more speculative for that reason, but it is a serious idea taken seriously by people who study the origins of human social behavior. Not a throwaway line. None of this means anything you eat today is a health prescription pulled from the Pleistocene. Researchers are still split on exactly when cooking began, how much credit it deserves against other pressures like meat eating or social cooperation, and how far the social claims about pair bonding really extend. What is not seriously disputed is the basic physics. Cooked food gives you more usable energy for less digestive costs than raw food does, and that trade-shaped teeth, gut size, and brain growth over a very long stretch of time. Think about how far the outsourcing has gone since then. Your ancestors cooked over a fire they built themselves, from wood they gathered themselves, watching the food the whole time. You can have a meal ready in the time it takes to walk to a corner store, prepared somewhere you will never see, by a process you never have to think about. That is not a judgment on any particular way of eating, and it is not a claim that older is automatically better. It is just a measure of distance. The trade your ancestors made, more energy for less chewing time, has kept compounding for hundreds of thousands of years, and you are living at the far end of it, holding a level of food convenience that a Homo erectus tending a hearth could not have imagined even as a fantasy. Which brings us back to that snack you grabbed without thinking. It took you seconds, because your ancestors spent something like 2 million years, give or take, a debated few 100,000, trading raw endurance for cooked efficiency. Every easy bite you take today, you take on borrowed time, paid for at a hearth you will never see, by people who traded hours of chewing for a fire that quietly changed what a human body even is.